And on the line with us is Steve Keen. Steve is a professor of economics at Kingston University, London, the author of Debunking Economics. His next book is tentatively titled, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? And Steve, welcome back to the program.
Great to be with you again, Thom. Long time.
It's great. Indeed. It's been too long since we've talked. I'm curious your thoughts on Brexit.
Well, I was in favour of it, and the reason is not so much about the economic consequences for England, which I think have been exaggerated dramatically by those who are arguing for Remain, but I pose myself what I call the Groucho Marxist question. I'm in a club. Do I want to belong here? The club being the EU, and the answer is categorically not. It's a club which was supposed to be there to bring Europeans together, and the economic policies that it employed to do that are fundamentally neoliberal policies, which even the IMF now has admitted have been at best oversold and at worst actually disastrous. And those policies are enshrined in all the various treaties of the European Union, but of course particularly the Euro. Thankfully, the UK didn't belong to that, but this was a chance for one country that's part of that whole scheme to pull out and say, let's do this all over again, let's restart. And that's why I voted for it. Hopefully it'll lead to other countries literally pulling out of the euro, which I think is extremely necessary.
Yeah, I'm surprised Greece didn't succeed in doing that early on when Syriza came to power. But I think your analysis is spot on. I had described this earlier as back in the 40s when the idea of the European Union was put together. It was kind of parallel to the idea of the United Nations. You know, the League of Nations had failed after World War I. The United Nations came about after World War II. And the idea of a united Europe, it was like, you know, never again, no more war. If we're all interrelated with these interlocking trade agreements and travel agreements, then we're less likely to get insulated and paranoid and like, you know, like Germany became before World War II. But you know, which is a noble impulse. And in fact, arguably, when the thing was first put together, in some ways, you know, it was very progressive. But it seemed to me that when Thatcher came to power in '78 and Reagan in '80, that kind of kicked off the beginning of at least a decade or so of pretty radical changes, not only in the way that the United States governed itself with regard to our tax policies and our trade policies, but also with regard to the way the EU governed itself. And neoliberalism became and austerity and whatnot became kind of the name of the game. And we moved out of manufacturing and mercantilism and into financialization and neoliberalism, and it's not working. Is that a reasonable analysis?
Yeah, though I think you actually don't take it on early enough, because in many ways the European Union's own treaties right from about 1970 started shifting in that direction. But it's certainly from the time that Thatcher and Reagan got in power, then basically people who believe that a first-year economics textbook accurately describes reality took over setting economic policy. So what was in the aftermath of the Great Depression and the Second World War, you had a very strong humanist focus on why we should be unifying, and the beliefs came out of the experience of the market economy failing during the Great Depression. Now, that led to could have led to a significant change in economics, but of course the profession re-established itself, dressed up Keynes's ideas in the old classical guise, called them things like Hicks's ISLM model and so on. And with those models, they basically transferred, intersecting supply and demand curves from micro to macro, and thought it was all a nice little, the economy could be described as an equilibrium system again, completely ignoring the financial forces that gave us the Great Depression and enabling those forces to rip once more by deregulating everything, in the belief that a market system was superior to a combined market and government system. So the rot really set in 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty. And one thing you can say in favour of Maggie Thatcher is she decided not to sign up, she persuaded the Tories not to sign up to the European currency unit, and then the Labour Party after her also decided not to go with the euro, and that was the best decision the English ever made. But the real tragedy of the euro was to believe that you could have a currency union that would have the same effect as the fiscal union that America has. Now, a currency union means you can control the interest rate and you control money To some extent, you have a money growth similar across the entire country, but you don't have fiscal policy that means you can stabilise a deficit for Alabama with a surplus for California, and nobody even knows what they are. So it was badly designed from the very outset. Wynne Godley did a brilliant article back in 1992 I recommend everybody to read, called Maastricht and All That, in the London Review of Books, saying that given that the people who designed this thing clearly believed that you could manage a capitalist economy just with a central bank, they must have believed the economy is inherently stable. Since it's not, there'll be a crisis, and when the crisis occurs, the Maastricht Treaty will force the governments to impose austerity, and the only escape will be emigration.
Right. And he said this in 92.
Yeah, 1992.
Yeah. And this is exactly what has happened. And,
exactly what's happened.
Yeah, it's what happens when you lose control over your currency. I mean, the Eurozone has worked to the benefit of Germany and France. It's worked to the benefit of arguably some of the smaller countries, the poorer countries who have had an opportunity to have access to those large markets. But for countries like Spain and Greece and Italy and whatnot, when they went into a recession, typically when you go into a recession, that's when you deficit spend to get out of the recession. And being a member of the Eurozone prevented them from having debt over 3% of GDP, as I recall. And so they were,
that's right.
They were paralyzed. They were unable to, and continue to be. So how do you respond to folks who say, Steve, you were in favor of Brexit. I've been watching the news and reading Twitter. I know that only racists and bigots are in favor of Brexit. I mean,
some of the other racists and bigots who support Brexit include Michael Hudson and Richard Werner, and quite a few of my friends in progressive movements around the globe, because the racism has come out of the failure of the European Union project itself. That's why so many people are trying to leave Europe and move to England to escape the euro, fundamentally. That's where the pressures come from. We say it's happening because the euro is a failure. If you didn't have the euro causing the collapse of all the southern European economies, then there wouldn't be young Spaniards and Greeks and Italians and French people looking for jobs in English cafes at half what they could have earned if they got their jobs as fully qualified professionals back in their own countries. But they've got youth unemployment rates of between 25 and 50%. So that's been the real cause of the rise of racism over here. It's been the working class who's borne the brunt of this, also with the deindustrialization of England, as you mentioned earlier. Actually, a colleague pointed out to me that when the Euro project began, manufacturing is roughly 23% of German GDP and 23% of English GDP. Fast forward to now, it's still 23% of German GDP, but it's fallen to about 11% of English GDP.
Which is about the same as the United States, isn't it?
Oh,
it's about the same as the United States. I mean, pre-Reagan, we were 25 to 30% manufacturing. Now we're around 11%, aren't we?
Yeah. You've deindustrialized to China. We deindustrialized everywhere else.
Yeah. And so if what's happened is we had a couple hundred years of industrial/mercantilist policies that helped build a strong middle class and a strong nation. And then over the last 30 years, we said, okay, that worked fine, but we're going to try something else. It's a new era. We've got the internet and stuff. And so let's go with a financialization model where we'll make money with money rather than making goods. We'll let those poor countries make the goods for us. We'll move all that to China and let them deal with the pollution. And we'll have all these wonderful new jobs. It has failed, this system. So what do we do? Do we say, okay, let's change our trade policies and go back to mercantilism and industrialism and start manufacturing again? Or do we do something entirely completely different, like say, we're going to provide everybody with a guaranteed minimum income, and we're going to, come up with some, develop co-ops, to create new kinds of corporate systems that aren't for profit? What are the options?
Well, my first option is to reduce the level of private debt, because what's actually driven this false apparent growth from 1980 on, and stunningly so in the case of England, I might add, is just an explosion of the level of private debt. As you know, I argued for a long time that economists get it wrong by ignoring credit and analysing the economy, and they treat demand as coming solely from GDP. I say it comes from GDP, which I see as the turnover of existing money, plus credit, which is the creation of new debt that creates money and demand at the same time. And if you have the sluggish demand you've got from the actual turnover of existing money, that's been supplanted replaced by a dramatic expansion in debt. In America's case, you've spent about one entire year's additional GDP out of borrowed money over the last 20 years. England has spent about 1.2 times GDP over the last 25 years just by extending credit. Now, of course, you get to the point you can't do that anymore, and you have a credit constipated system, a private debt constipated system, and there'll be no more credit growth, and therefore that demand you relied upon to keep you going is gone. That's the situation both America and England are in now. So the first step to get out of it is to write that debt off. And we could do that using the government's money creation capacity for what some people call people's QE, and I call the modern debt jubilee, and do it in such a way you don't benefit savers over debtors, debtors over savers, by the way. That could be done. So with that particular trick done, you'd have more capacity for demand, but you would also need to go back and start rebuilding a manufacturing basis. Right. And we do have to face that we're going to have a guaranteed income at some stage, because we now have the capability to replace labour with robots.
Yeah, brilliant stuff, brilliant stuff. Steve Keen, thanks so much for being with us, Steve.
Welcome, Matt.
Great talking with you. Steve is a Kingston University, a professor of economics at Kingston University, London. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.